Part 2. The Skull Taker. The blood froze in Bletta's putrid heart as he realized just what it was he had so boldly challenged. The bloated Wei Kong champion stumbled back, eyes bulging with horror. Prayers to his debased crow god slobbering through suddenly numb lips. The 7 section chain hung limp from his fingers, grown flaccid. Bleda continued to watch the strange warrior before him in the dark armor. No mortal man, this warrior, nothing mortal could have moved the way he did, striking and slashing in a relentless cascade of violence. Tireless, remorseless, unstoppable, the black blade rose and fell in a butcher's dance, hewing and hacking, ripping and tearing. Bleda had spread the divine rot to his entire entourage, setting the wave after wave of possessed slaves to attack the warrior. The demons charged at him, chopping at him with their corrupt plague blades, the demonic steel simply recoiling from its impacts against the man's unholy armor, sending even the demons reeling. The warrior gave his foes no quarter, no mercy. His smoking blade was everywhere, stabbing into rotten lungs, splitting open decayed bellies, lopping off limbs and heads. The plague bearers did not falter, even in the midst of the massacre. But their numbers, the foul vapors that surrounded them, the poisonous touch of their swords, none of these were enough to prevail against their foe. The slow, sickly movements of the demons were unequal to the swift, murderous attacks of the warrior. The plague bearers fought with the hellish vitality beyond that of anything merely mortal, enduring wounds that would have brought the strongest man low. They did not know pain. They did not fear death. They only knew what their master demanded of them. And so they fought on, oblivious to the carnage slowly consuming them all. A lion among jackals, the warrior carved a gory swath through the festering, moaning demons. Again and again his blade cut through their diseased flesh, spilling their foul ichor across the shimmering sand, until there was little of the mortal shell left to contain their noxious essence. Plague bearers fell beneath his sword, hacked to pieces, collapsing into pools of putrescence as their demonic essence fled back into the realm of the gods. It was while the warrior was fighting, a crooked-backed, fly-faced demon with its heavy cloak, that his heavy cloak was slashed by the plague bearer's sword. The stranger's side was exposed for the first time. Bleda could see the chain that crossed the man's chest, from right shoulder to left hip, a grisly trophy grinning at him from the chain, the skull of a man. The chain lopped through its sockets, its forehead branded with the rune of Khorne. That was the moment when Bleda recognized his enemy for who and what he was. The Skull Taker brought his sword smashing down into the fanged visage of the plague bearer, rupturing its cyclopean eye and collapsing the bone beneath. The thing staggered away, swiping blindly at him with its claws. The warrior pursued the maimed demon, pausing only for the instant it took to chop the hand from a demon closing upon him from the other side. Returning to his first foe, the Skull Taker stabbed his blade into the thing's chest, impaling it upon his sword. With brutal savagery, he ripped his weapon free, sending a spray of stagnant black ichor and splintered ribs across the faceted side of a crystal spire. The warrior did not pause, pivoting as he won his sword free, bringing the blade around in a shrieking arc that slashed through the leg of another demon. The thing bleated and pitched forwards before it could rise. The Skull Taker brought the edge of its weapon down upon his head. Only 5 of the demons remained. They circled the Skull Taker, ropes of filth dripping from their wounds. Drool slopped down their faces. The pus-hued eyes of the plague bearers burned into those behind the skull mask of the warrior's helm, blazing with a corrupt inner fire. The Skull Taker glared back, his black blade screaming hungrily in his hand. the shard sand crunching beneath his boots as he pivoted to watch the demons as they shuffled around him, tightening their circle. As one, the fiends rushed him, hooves and peeling feet slapping against the sand. The first demon flung its body at the man, exulting as the sword smashed into it and erupting from its back with volcanic fury. The dying demon's arms twisted impossibly backwards, grabbing the smoking metal, piercing its body. With all the strength left in its mortal shell, the demon held the Skull Taker's sword, keeping it sheathed in its monster's corrupt flesh. The other demons rushed the Skull Taker, crushing him beneath their diseased mass, smashing him to the earth beneath their oozing weight. A nervous laugh wheezed through Bleda's swollen lips, while he watched the plague bearers tear at the man, pinned beneath them with their claws, and stabbing awkwardly at him with their corroded swords. Not a monster from the pits of legend after all, only a man. One who would soon offer up his soul to Neglin when the demons ripped it from his body. The chieftain marched forwards, his flabby face twisting in a sneer of triumph made bitter by the memory of his moment of terror. Bleda's step faltered abruptly, and a sneer fell from his face. The heap of plague bearers shifted upwards, exploding in a burst of primal strength and savagery. The demons were hurled to the ground as the Skull Taker rose once more. The warrior's hand was locked around the neck of a demon, his steel fingers digging into its throat, filth gushing from the wound. The man's armor was pitted and gouged, the cloak torn and ragged. Bleda could see something hot and black dripping from the Skull Taker's wounds. Even as he watched, the flow became a trickle, and the rents in the armor closed, oozing shut as though they had never been. One of the fallen demons lunged at the Skull Taker as he strangled its fellow. The warrior spun around, whipping the body of the demon he held, smashing the one with the other. The rising demon crumpled under the impact, its collarbone shattered. The demon he held slipped from his hands and was, by the force of the impact, and tore its head from its shoulders. The thing slopped against the ground, shuddering as the diseased spirit abandoned the desiccated husk, fleeing back into the void. Bleda saw the other two plague bearers charging at the Skull Taker, but he had no longer any illusions. Who would prevail? The Vegkhung started to back away again, wondering if he had time to flee back into the tunnels, wondering if the Skull Taker was able to find him, even in the dank, noxious gloom. Then his eyes closed upon the plague bearer impaled upon the Skull Taker's sword. The demon's body had largely disintegrated into a pile of sludge, but the sword was still there, mired in filth. He looked again at the warrior facing off against the demons. A desperate hope came to the hung chieftain. He scrambled across the shard sand, his huge frame moving with the speed that belied his obscene bulk. He hurried towards the black sword. If he could use the weapon against the Skull Taker, kill the monster with his own sword. The Skull Taker turned from the mangled ruin of the last plague bearer, his skull mask turning towards Bleda as the fat chieftain rushed for the sword, the warrior moving to intercept his foe. Locke's hand slapped against his hip as he stalked after the hung. Bleda stopped, raising his 7-section chain. His chubby arms whipped the weapon through the air, lashing out at the Skull Taker with the flailing lengths of rod and chain. The warrior staggered as the corrupt bronze of segments smacked into him, sizzling against his armor as they struck. A filthy green smog rose from the wounds, steaming into the air. Bleda snarled, itching closer to the black sword, even as he continued to whip the chain through the air. The droning buzz sounded from the chain, the sound of vermin on the wing, and its wielder swung faster and faster, creating a blinding curtain of crushing metal and poisonous fumes. As Bleda edged towards the sword, the Skull Taker fought his way through the crushing bronze rods. His breastplate smoldered where the rods had struck him, the left horn of his helm partially melted by the corrosive touch of the weapon. Blood, dark and streaming, bubbled from the new rents in his armor, sizzling as it dripped into the shimmering sand. Blood's satisfaction at the damage his enchanted weapon visited upon the monstrous warrior was tempered by the fact that its touch had not broken the man. Another foe would be reduced to a quivering mass, retching and shivering as the vile influence of the chain's power polluted his body. The Skull Taker kept coming, daring the tempest of Bleda's chain. Foot by foot, he was closing upon the puddle of ruin and his terrible sword. The Hung Khan gave a bubbling shout, jerking the chain savagely in his hand. The rods whipped around the Skull Taker's body, coiling around his left arm. Bleda grunted in satisfaction, putting his entire weight into one savage pull of the chain. The Skull Taker staggered as the trapped arm popped out of its socket, hanging limp and useless beside his body. Bleda shuddered to find that even such an injury had drawn no cry of pain from the warrior. His horror at the observation was diminished as he found the nearness of the pool and the black sword. Still keeping his hand firmly around the seventh of his chained weapon's bronze rods, Bleda lunged for the gruesome blade. Bleda's fat face twisted back into its triumphant sneer as his chubby fingers closed around the hilt of the sword. Bubbling laughter oozed from the warlord's mouth as he tore the weapon free from the filth of the plague bearer. Laughter decayed into a drawn-out scream. The sword fell from Bleda's mutilated hand, fat and flesh dripping from the charred extremity in greasy ropes. The black sword fell to the ground, its edge smoking, an eerie voice raised in a ravenous howl. Bleda pitched to the ground as a chain in his other hand was ripped from his grasp. The chieftain coughed in terror as he saw the Skull Taker free himself from the coils of the chain, casting the magic weapon aside as though it were so much rubbish. Then the killer was advancing on him once more, the grisly scars in his armor healing once more with every step. Croaking wheezes and racking coughs slopped from Bleda's swollen lips as the chieftain tried to summon the hideous power of his god. Curses and poxes, spells to wither and ruin, hexes and blights, all were known to the lord of the Wei Kung, for Neglin was indulgent with his servants, but none could ooze their way into his tongue, while the searing agony of his mangled hand pulsed through his thoughts and thundered through his blood. Bleda fought to calm his spirit, to draw upon the powers he had been taught, but the power would not relent. The pain would not relent. The Skull Taker loomed over the kneeling Khan. He reached to his shoulder, wrenching his left arm back into place with a dull crack. The warrior's skull mask glared down at the quivering chieftain. Reaching down, he retrieved his black blade. Metal gauntlets tightening around the smoking weapon. The scene lingered. The silent warrior towering over the broken, obese hulk of the gasping chieftain. The molten touch of the black blade had spread up Bleda's arm, reducing muscle to strips and fried meat, exposing bone that were burned black. When Bleda looked up, the Khan stared into the murderous embers behind the warrior's helm. When the Skull Taker saw the terror and defeat in the chieftain's eyes, only then did he strike. In one fluid motion, the black blade was drawn back, then flashing forward in a brutal sweep of smoke and sound. Bleda's swollen head, with its grotesque antlers and bulging eyes, leapt from the Khan's shoulders, dropping into the charred sand with a wet plop. The headless trunk of the chieftain crumpled upon itself, sagging into the ground like a ruptured boil. The Skull Taker kicked Bleda's lifeless bulk aside. Stalking across the charred sand, he knelt beside the chieftain's staring head. He lifted it from the ground, brushing the clinging shivers of shard and glass from the bloated flesh. Then he brought the keen edge of his sword against its new trophy, stripping the warlord's features from its head. Only when the rune of Khorne branded upon the bone beneath Bleda's flesh stood exposed beneath the blazing stars did the warrior relent. He lifted the flayed husks to the sky. Thunder roared in the cloudless night, causing the crystal spires to shiver and growl with the growl of a hungry god.